I am Yurtsever. I work as an assistant professor at Muğla Koçman University, Faculty of Architecture and Department of Architecture. Today I will talk about on housing via Lagoon life philosophy. I discussed the issue in 5 main sections. I didn't want to separate them from each other, because I tried to evaluate all of them interbedded, and I tried to allow new questions in each section. We can consider the merge of the main problem and the method of handling the issue as a case study. I see the whole work as the first draft stage, the first text of creating a manifest itself. Therefore, it can be seen as an interrogation pattern in the loop in this process of assessing it. I said the study so much, but I did not comment on the main problem. The main problem is to look for an alternative, as in many areas in urban or metropolitan life, which is changing, transforming. The reason for going to this quest is that there are some cracks, unrest, and structures that disrupt the dynamics. Maybe what looks good in the beginning and what looks beautiful in the beginning does not have a reflection as much as expected over time. I would like to mention the main cause of the study before coming to the topics like how to reach this point, what kind of alternative we can talk about it. In an order that is highly inclined to increase, gains that decrement can actually enable productivity is undeniable. I am going to touch this a little bit, and my other research goals revolving around this context are minimalism, everyday life, urban life, metropolitanization, Lagom life, home, individual, and collective conscious. If we briefly touched on the development of housing in İhsan Bilgin's research on Turkey, he defines the years between from 1839 to 1920 as relative modernization. Some type of apartments appeared in this era. This sample is from Fener, Istanbul. And these samples are also from Istanbul. He defines 1920 to 1946 as radical modernization, neighborhood scale changes. The plans are now prepared for motor vehicles. In a sense, the city spine forms itself with highways. The neighborhood scale comes to the fore with the understanding of mass housing at this point. And he defines this era neither city nor village. In the 1945 to 1980s, a populist approach prevailed. This time, migration is brought to the agenda, and slum settlements began to appear more frequently as migration led to a population boom, and new apartments are now needed. So single reinforced concrete apartments start to take place in the city. Since the 80s, modernization continues to dominate as a crisis. and the sense of scale moves away from the human scale. The definition of an apartment reproduces itself in every so-called process. Requirements are so-called, and these so-called requirements used make society feel that they need what is done. With the so-called presentation of this never-ending old new apartment and the mass housing, a settlement concept called residence type emerges. The apartments which were quickly introduced in this process, and then the residence-type buildings we are accustomed to see, moved away from the meaning of home and represented transience rather than permanence. Even if it is not necessary to fully root in the discussion of permanence and transience, the potential of these two situations should be considered. In this context, conceptual research for settlement was developed through minimalism. It might be good to talk at this mess from the reversely. Of course, it would not be possible not to touch minimalism in a situation that is addressed through the philosophy of degrees. So, what exactly is minimalism? Or above all, does it suit our daily routines? Yes, the philosophy of degrees perhaps sounds simple, but is minimalism capable of doing this? We have to question them a bit. And minimalism finds its response in the field of architecture and design as to go to the simplest, most economical and functional result with the least materials. So the meaning of the purity of minimalism in art transforms itself a little here. Although it's important that what is formed looks pure, it has a meaning that it adds to itself, the function. The function is not included in this process in a subsequently fabricated form. Due to the purity of the formation, it's completely naturally involved in this process. Today, the minimal approach also manifests itself as a life choice, although it varies at different scales depending on the situation. It's thought that it's basically far from the logic of minimalism, while the everyday lifestyle makes it necessary to participate in many activities at the same time. The logic of minimalism to share something that exists only in its own state does not match this daily routine. So many things can symbolize many other situations besides their own. More preciously, it's the fact that any situation is an intermediary for expressing another situation. In this way, is moves away from the core logic of minimalism. And at this point, Lagom manifests itself. Lagom is essence represents a way of life, and while this attitude towards simplification is an understanding in Scandinavian countries, it has started to spread to various parts of the world over time. Similarly, except Sweden, other examples referring to a whole philosophy of life are coming from Norway and Denmark. The word Lagom means exactly as it should be in Swedish, and therefore, instead of treating the subject as just as architectural trend, it would be more appropriate to consider in consider it as a way of life, as it is in essence. Although the Legume approach has become more widespread in terms of decoration and interior design today, this concept has a critical content that can be adapted to an urban lifestyle. With the interpretation of the requirements scale according to different situations, this understanding can be transferred from the interior to urban life. Mies van der Rohe's cult expression less is more may actually be suitable for this lifestyle. In addition to this, accomplishments such as "but few are boring" should be done. Legume, an alternative lifestyle that emerged from a kind of simplification, has recently started to spread to many different places than Scandinavian region. This understanding of life, which is not based on proliferation, focuses on objects or situations as much as needed rather than decreasing. In fact, the understanding of function in minimalism can find itself in Legume in the current sense, because Legume, which is purely functional approach, offers a table of requirements for that moment. Legume is an average life philosophy. This average requires mastering what may be needed depending on circumstances. So it's open to change. The more dual, stationary, and constant understanding in minimalism is carried to a much more up-to-date, dynamic, and variable structure in Legume. The quantity-sufficient approach is important at this point. This is what distinguishes Lagoon from a fully minimalist and highly purified lifestyle. Lagoon Philosophy, which will allow minimalism to break away from its purified, reduced purity and stagnation, reach a much more dynamic structure, also reveals its potential at this point. In fact, Legume focuses on an understanding that keeps up with its position in a sense, and in doing so, fully emphasizes the individual and nature. Adaptation threshold has a critical value in this case. The point where the situation is critical and design specific is that every individual's daily routine and requirements may be different. In fact, the Lagoon Philosophy comes into play at this point. This situation varies depending on how the person's requirement pattern is interpreted. This philosophy, which is deemed appropriate to be adopted as a life philosophy, is the discovery that the person questions what he needs at that moment and whether he really needs it and how he can evaluate it. Therefore, making a questioning of needs according to the moment can also enable the person to discover himself while creating his own life philosophy. Although this schizophrenic cast sounds like a vicious environment, at some point it actually enables the person to make sense of himself. It also causes it to seek an organization that can appeal to many essentially hidden needs and actions. Therefore, the cooperation of life and the real meaning everyday life involves the individual into a process that will enable him to discover himself and create an environment for a holistic production. The examples that we can see Legume in a certain order in the city may vary. The reason for this is the structure that takes shape according to the requirements. This structure reveals alternative lifestyles, considering that the only thing that can be taken into focus in Lagom Utopia is the needs and the individual. It can be said to be a kind of function-oriented. In the event that many things are defined according to the environment in which it's located, function also needs to be redefined in its cycle, whether it's just a goal-oriented function or a function that can address a more holistic situation that extends its scope should be evaluated within the framework of daily definitions. An example can be given from a YouTube channel called Daire. It means flat in Turkish. It can be seen as a lifestyle that is integrated with the city order of a family of four. It offers an alternative and gives inspiration in terms of Lagom. Well, then if we go back to the beginning, what are the conditions today? As stated in Legume, the meaning of as it should be carries an intrinsically pure investigation of need. It's true that monotype housing settlements, which make all human needs equal and ignore social and cultural differences and psychological factors, do not create a satisfactory environment for the user. People are included in these environments because they often are obliged to it or be forced to. Therefore, what is important is that the individual can draw a frame according to his or her own lifestyle, goals, and routines in daily life. While the housing research within the scope of the study is taken over the settlement, the lagoon that comes to the fore is a tool to make understanding requirements and daily life observations. The meaning of the house changes within the framework of ideal housing concepts and social factors. In addition to this, it's influenced in terms of building materials as well as the view of life philosophy, the change of daily routines and the change of social relations. The study of architectural psychology gains importance at this point. The task of this psychology is to determine some spiritual effects that the art of building can access with its own tools. Therefore, all urbanization takes place in a cycle that affects the existing as well as is affected by the existing one. The city, which was a human product at the beginning of the construction process, has become a transformation area with some relations of interest over time. In actively participates in this construction process, sociologically, in the sense of a whole urban tectonic, and this cycle has a rhythm that can be called routine or usual itself. This natural flow provides vitality to the city and its inhabitants. However, the destruction of this natural flow at some point will result in chaos for that city and all stakeholders. It's possible to observe this situation in cities that are gradually taking a step towards metropolitanization with an increasing population that cannot be prevented. The sense of belonging to the city decreases. The person becomes more and more alienated. Where alienation exists, the nature of participation and collectivity must also be questioned. The visual consumption culture that can only live in the metropolis threatens the autonomy and creativity of individuals. Therefore, the concept of belonging becomes different here, and it moves away from the known sense of ownership and adopts a new place. It's impossible to say that it has completely disappeared and that this type of lifestyle has negative side effects. It might also have a structure that produces solutions at many points. At this point, The subject that needs to be studied and evaluated is two concepts such as belonging, freedom, meaning, and space, which we adopt and put into a mold. For example, this is what happens in the concept of belonging. In order for a person to feel belonging to a place, it does not have to have spent many years in that place. This is a situation that can change relatively. At this point, the reliable field of the past should evolve towards a new search for itself beyond the clarification of a continuous definition, and make some comments about the current situation. For example, the concept of belonging, which we think is alienated, takes on an identity that sometimes feels like it belongs, but sometimes wants to get away from it. Sometimes, when this identity is reflected in architecture, it acquires false jargon. We can think of it as a hollow surface that looks like them but is actually not. And therefore, when deepening problems begin to occur, this architecture, which produces a superficial, instant, and relative solution, affects its perspective in this direction and drags to the societies in its host towards the show society. This situation, which seems a small detail, is in sense closed form to criticize. If we come to the concept of belonging again, this slippery feeling between fleeing and staying brings with its architectural psychology that needs to be investigated. In addition, there are few more questions to ask. What kind of life does this feeling want to be involved in? What kind of way does he find himself? What can it be handled in the context of architecture? Zahler has identified 5 subgroups to be considered when planning for the future from today's conditions: ecology and environment, information and technology, usability, choice of options, flexibility. As can be seen from here, it is noteworthy that one of the most important main components in the future planning is on freedom. It's a way of living that focuses on the needs of the individual and then the society. These needs should be evaluated psychologically, physiologically, and sociologically. When we think of life in detail with housing and other actions on its periphery, it brings to mind the question of, is the change of housing can be a new type of utopia with the Lagoon philosophy. One of the most important questions that can be asked in this utopia or dystopia according to the situation should be, how much do we really want this freedom? It may be necessary to ask whether freedom is something that is made effort to earn it or something usual as it is. It's hard to say that this approach, trials and search thought, is the majority yet, considering that we need such up-to-date and everyday life-related utopias. It's considered important to produce interpreted experiments in this context and to continue housing research in this context also. These are my references. And thank you for your attention. If you want to ask me any question, please do not hesitate to mail me. Have a nice day.